Today, we're getting into a seemingly quiet but actually really pivotal moment in American history,
Uh-huh.
the U.S. presidential election of 1816.
That's right.
We've looked at some fascinating accounts, some analyses, and really our mission here is to figure out why this election, which seems kind of low drama on the surface, actually ended up, fundamentally reshaping the country.
Exactly. Think of it less like just another election and more like a snapshot. A nation really in transition.
Okay.
The records we've got, they detail a country picking itself up after a war, a political landscape that's massively shifting, and an election that was, well, revolutionary in its own way.
Right, let's unpack that.
Okay.
1816. So the War of 1812 is over, the dust is settling, and the
Uh-huh.
context we're seeing suggests, a nation trying to piece itself back together. The Capitol building itself was still being rebuilt, wasn't it?
Still under construction, absolutely.
Yeah.
And you had this real surge of national pride, almost like everyone breathed a collective sigh of relief
Mhm.
after the war.
But also maybe some exhaustion.
Definitely. The war, it boosted American confidence in the long run, but it also showed some real vulnerabilities. So the desire for stability, for unity, you could really feel it. And this weariness with conflict absolutely shaped the political mood.
And politically, things were just transforming. The accounts we've looked at, they really point to the Federalist Party being in, serious trouble.
Oh, big trouble.
While the Democratic Republicans were clearly on the rise, what was driving that huge power shift?
Well, the big thing was the Federalists' opposition to the War of 1812. That turned out to be just a massive miscalculation.
Politically toxic, basically.
Pretty much. The public mood saw their stance as, frankly, unpatriotic, especially after the Hartford Convention.
Ah, yes, that comes up a lot.
Right. The perception, which the Democratic-Republican press definitely pushed, was that while the country's fighting a war, these key Federalists are meeting in secret, maybe even talking about undermining the whole effort, possibly even secession.
Which sounds pretty bad today and sounded even worse then, I imagine.
Extremely unpatriotic. It just hammered their credibility. So
Yeah.
this election, it wasn't just, one party losing. It was like a rejection of that older, maybe more elite centralized idea of authority.
Hmm.
People were leaning towards a more populist nationalist feeling, and that had huge implications for how parties would need to connect with voters later on.
Okay, so enter the key players. James Monroe, the Democratic Republican candidate. He looks really strong on paper, doesn't he?
He really does.
The accounts highlight his background, Revolutionary War vet, experienced diplomat. He was Secretary of State at the time.
Right.
He had this image, it seems, of being steady, experienced, patriotic, promising unity.
A solid profile for the times. And his running mate, Daniel D. Tompkins, the governor of New York, also a pretty respected figure.
So it sounds like a dream ticket, almost unbeatable.
It was a very powerful combination, yeah. They really knew how to capitalize on that Democratic-Republican dominance and that widespread desire for experienced leadership after all the instability. Monroe's war record hit home, and his message, national unity, progress, it just fit the moment perfectly.
And then on the Federalist side, you had Rufus King.
Rufus King, yeah.
The sources kind of paint him as a figure from maybe an earlier time. Continental Congress, the Senate, respected, but maybe facing a losing battle.
Definitely an uphill battle. The Federalist Party just seemed fractured, out of sync with where the country was heading.
And the fact that he didn't even have a running mate, that says a lot, doesn't it?
It really does. It just highlights how disorganized, how in disarray the Federalists were. They just couldn't pull together a cohesive alternative to Monroe and the Democratic Republicans.
So what were people actually arguing about in this election? Because the sources suggest, surprisingly little major debate.
Yeah, it's kind of strange from our perspective.
Monroe was talking about national unity, internal improvements, building roads, canals, connecting the country.
Infrastructure, basically.
Right. And supporting American industry. Like policies to boost domestic production rely less on foreign goods. Early economic nationalism, you could call it.
That's a good way to put it. And what's really fascinating is how little major policy clash there seemed to be. Monroe's platform just had broad appeal. The country was eager for development, eager for a common purpose after the war. He really tapped into that national mood.
And King, what was his angle? Apparently he focused on slavery, criticizing its expansion into new territories.
He did.
You'd think a strong moral stance like that would get some traction, but it seems like it just wasn't enough. Why didn't it save his campaign?
It's a really interesting point. King's position on slavery, looking back, was obviously significant, even prescient, you might say. But in 1816, that issue just hadn't reached the boiling point it would later. The immediate concerns, things like solidifying the nation, getting the economy going again, those overshadowed the slavery question for a lot of voters. Plus, honestly, the Federalists just didn't have the political muscle anymore to make it a winning issue.
Right. And the campaigning itself, so different back then. We're talking partisan newspapers, right? Like really biased
Oh,
ones.
intensely partisan. They weren't just reporting, they were actively shaping opinions, often with pretty inflammatory stuff.
And letter writing campaigns, state legislatures choosing electors, not exactly direct popular vote everywhere.
Not at all. The communication was totally different.
Yeah.
And yeah, state legislatures often pick the electors, so campaigning often meant trying to influence those guys, not necessarily winning over every single voter directly in every state.
So the results come in landslide, right?
Complete landslide for Monroe. He got 183 electoral votes. King only managed 34.
Wow. And King only won 3 states, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Delaware.
That's it. Those were kind of the last holdouts, the final Federalist strongholds. Monroe's win just cemented the collapse of the Federalists as a national force.
Which leads us right into this phrase you always hear, the era of good feelings.
Ah, yes, the famous era.
But the sources we have suggest, well, maybe good feelings is stretching it a bit. It looked harmonious on top, but there were still tensions underneath. Factions, regional interests.
Absolutely. That label, era of good feelings, it's something historians kind of slapped on later. Yes, the overt party versus party fighting at the national level died down because, well, the Federalists were basically gone.
Right.
But disagreements over big stuff, states' rights, economic policy, and definitely slavery, those didn't disappear. They just simmered down for a bit, ready to bubble up again later, often within the dominant Democratic-Republican Party itself.
So the lack of open conflict kind of masked these growing regional splits.
Precisely. That internal friction, even if less obvious, was really important groundwork for the intense sectionalism that came later.
Okay, so pulling it all together, why should we care about the seemingly lopsided election from way back when? What's the takeaway?
Well, I think if you look at the big picture, 1816 is a really powerful reminder of how fluid political power can be. You had a dominant party, the Federalists, just declined pretty rapidly because they made missteps, they didn't adapt. It makes you think about how temporary any political dominance might be, you know?
That's a really important point. And it also highlights that shift in American identity. We talked about this growing sense of nationalism, this push for expansion, building the economy.
Exactly. After the war, there was this surge in national pride, this ambition to make the U.S. a bigger player on the world stage. Monroe's policies really reflected that, setting the stage for more growth, more territory.
And maybe the most crucial thing is how this quiet revolution, as some call it, actually laid the groundwork for future fights.
That's key.
The very issues that seemed kind of muted in 1816 slavery, federal government's role in building things, the whole states versus nation power balance. Those were the issues that would just explode later on.
Absolutely. Monroe's election, which seemed to unify everyone, really just papered over these cracks. These fundamental debates were just waiting for their moment to come back much stronger. And sadly, they defined politics for the next 50 years and, well, ultimately lead to the Civil War.
So wrapping up this deep dive on 1816, it really hits home how even these less flashy political moments can have huge, long-lasting effects. Not a nail-biter election, but it totally reshaped where America was headed.
Yeah, and maybe a final thought for you, the listener. Think about what other seemingly quiet times or events in history might have had a similar, maybe less obvious, but equally massive impact on the world we live in now. It's kind of interesting to think about how the past keeps shaping the present, sometimes in ways we don't immediately see.
Absolutely.